In this recording, we're going to look at the structure of the bladder, the urethra, and the ureters, as well as look at the nervous innervation of these structures. So the kidneys are producing the urine, and the urine are transported by way of the ureters, which you see right here, down and stored in the bladder. And we're producing urine as we speak, and the bladder's there to kind of just store it. And then when it's an appropriate time, contraction of that bladder will help to eliminate that, and it's going to travel via the urethra outside of the body. Now, if we start with the ureters right here. So we have two of them. They are lined by transitional epithelium, and the urine travels to the bladder, and they enter the bladder through these openings called the uretal openings. They're designed that when the bladder contracts, the urine doesn't go back up into the ureters. As I mentioned, the epithelium that lines the ureters is transitional epithelium. So I'll write that out. So transitional epithelium, which is part of that mucosa. Mucosa is kind of the innermost layer of this structure. The ureters also have smooth muscle, and contraction of that muscle helps with the movement of the urine into the bladder, and they refer to it as actually peristalsis. And there's some connective tissue, this fibrous connective tissue, that's referred to as serosa, that surrounds the ureters. Now, when the urine enters the bladder, if we look at the bladder, it's actually in the pelvic cavity. And the picture that you're seeing, this is a bladder from a male, because I see the prostate gland right here. This organ is also lined by transitional epithelium. Now remember, transitional epithelium is many, many layers, and they have the dome cells. And those dome cells have the ability to change their shape. So when the bladder is stretched, it's filling, those top layers start to flatten out. It almost looks like stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. But when it's not stretched, you'll see kind of the top layers of cells kind of look like that. Now the bladder itself has a layer of smooth muscle right here, and they actually refer to that as the detrusor muscle. So contraction of that muscle will help with voiding the bladder, to empty the bladder. This region right in here, kind of this triangular region, is referred to as the trigon of the bladder. It's triangular. They say it kind of acts like a funnel to kind of funnel that urine to the opening in the urethra. And at the neck of the bladder will have kind of layer of muscle called the internal urethral sphincter muscle. And that internal urethral sphincter muscle is smooth muscle. Another thing I want to bring your attention to is the bladder has these folds, these mucosal folds called the rugae. You'll see rugae also in the stomach. So it allows to increase surface area, so as the bladder fills up, those rugae kind of flatten out, so it increases that volume capacity of the bladder. Now, as I mentioned previously, at the neck of the bladder, you have this smooth muscle called the internal urethral sphincter. Now, it's innervated by the hypogastric nerve, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to use this here. So here's a male, here's a female. So right in here, let's do it in green. There's the internal urethral sphincter in the female, and here it is in the male. And that is innervated by the hypogastric nerve. And the hypogastric nerve has sympathetic fibers. And what it pretty much does is it keeps that sphincter contracted to prevent urine from exiting the bladder, and it has to be inhibited when we want to empty the bladder. Now, the bladder itself is innervated by the hypogastric nerve, which has sympathetic fibers, and that will inhibit contraction of that bladder when you want to store urine. The pelvic splanchnic nerve, and I'll write that out for you. It's going to be written out again later, but might as well write it down now. The pelvic splanchnic nerves, care how you pronounce it, that has parasympathetic fibers. That innervates the bladder wall, and that will, when we want to void the bladder, when we want to empty the bladder, that will stimulate contraction of the detrusor muscle. So normally that bladder's there to store it, but when we want to empty the bladder, we'll contract that detrusor muscle. Now the other thing I want to mention is something that you see right in here. That is the external urethral sphincter muscle. That is skeletal muscle. And you'll notice it's kind of around the urethra. So let's look at the urethra and then we'll talk about that sphincter muscle. So if you notice automatically, the female urethra is much shorter than the male. Male, actually, the urethra is divided into 3 regions. The region that runs through the prostate gland is the prostatic urethra. This little tiny area right here that runs through the urogenital diaphragm, and that's the area where it's going to be encircled by the external urethral sphincter. That is called the membranous urethra. And so, again, that's circled by the external urethral sphincter muscle. And then we have the very, very long penile urethra in the male. The female, we don't break it up into regions, it's just the urethra. Now the urethra, the epithelium will change as we move down through it. It starts off as transitional epithelium near the neck, but then it will move to more stratified columnar to stratified squamous down towards the very end. The external urethral sphincter, as I mentioned, is a band of skeletal muscle, and it's innervated by the pudendal nerve, which has somatic nerve fibers. So this is part of the somatic nervous system. That external urethral sphincter remains contracted when we're filling up the bladder. It must be relaxed in order to be able to empty the bladder. So I just want to show you kind of what I've been mentioning is here's the, mentions the hypogastric nerve, which has sympathetic fibers, so that inhibits contractions of the detrusor muscle in the bladder, and it keeps the internal, which is more up here, the internal urethral sphincter contracted. The pelvic splanchnic nerves have parasympathetic fibers, and that innervates the detrusor muscle, and that stimulates contractions of the bladder. And the pudendal nerve innervates the external urethral sphincter, and that has somatic nerve fibers, and that keeps that sphincter contracted, but it must be relaxed in order to empty the bladder. And in lecture, you'll learn about the process of micturition, which is the process of which we empty the bladder, and you'll learn about the role of higher brain centers in emptying of the bladder.